Okay, so the talk I'm going to give is based on a paper I've written, 6 Political Philosophies in Search of a Virus, in which I explore the implications of political philosophy for understanding the pandemic, which I argue poses very, very interesting questions for social and political theory, including the nature and limits of the ethical responsibility of the state, the extent of personal liberty and human dignity, how the common good can be achieved, amongst other questions. We're coming out of a period when many countries have declared exceptionally states of emergency. Some of the major questions in moral and political philosophy have suddenly become highly relevant. Foucault's writings on biopolitical securitization and Agamben's notion of the state of exemption have now taken on a new reality as the spectre of state surveillance looms large over democracies. Now, with that in mind, and I explore here 6 main philosophical responses to the pandemic and the governance of life and death. I discuss interventions made by Agamben, Badiou, amongst others, Habermas, Zizek, Latour. But the first position I want to take is what I'm referring to here as classical utilitarianism, because I think that's very present, or I should say was very present, especially in the UK's initial response to the outbreak of the coronavirus. The term utilitarianism hasn't been used in the discussions, but I'm convinced that the response can be understood in the terms of classical utilitarianism, namely how to maximize the collective interest, even if it's based on the necessary debts of a large population. Now, while the notorious doctrine of herd immunity, of course, an established concept in epidemiology, could be mistaken for social Darwinism, it is in fact, in philosophical terms, a variant of utilitarianism, if one can cast epidemiological terms into the language of philosophy. Now, while this has been much ridiculed and government policy has shifted, and it has shifted several times, once it became apparent that the scale of deaths would be greater than what the health system could accommodate, utilitarian political theory nonetheless has considerable appeal. It's not to be equated with material gain, as is often thought. This may demand that the ends justify the means, but it's generally understood, as in the writings of Peter Singer, that one's interest, that the interest of one is not greater than the interest of the greatest number. But as a practical philosophy, it needs to be in possession of the required means to achieve the desired ends. And that's where things get complicated, is the desired end, the elimination of the disease, which is impossible, it seems, in the absence of a vaccine, or is the end the best possible outcome for most people? That's, say, natural immunity, which it seems can be achieved only with the aid of a vaccine. Now, it quickly became apparent that herd immunity could be both the means and an end, yet the reality is that it does not work as a means due to the extent of the death rates that would occur. So the problem here is the problem of utilitarianism, that it always leads to disadvantages for some. The disadvantages of dying, for example. If these disadvantages are not great, it may be the only way to achieve a desirable societal goal. Apart from herd immunity, lockdown, self-isolation, social distancing, or other possible means to counter the pandemic, the end is now generally agreed to be the delaying, to delay the spread of the disease. However, this end is less a normative end than it is a goal for a purpose that remains unclear. The problem is utilitarianism works well when the collective good is easily identifiable and can be achieved by by means that does not produce major disadvantages. It also requires what is not available in many instances, such as the present case, complete knowledge of the relevant facts, and of course, too, additionally, the time factor to achieve the desired results. So the failure of utilitarianism in Britain in March 2020 was less really a failure of utilitarian philosophy than a failure of politics and science. So what is the alternative to utilitarianism? This brings me to the second philosophical approach to the question. An influential body of thought that goes back to Kant would posit the centrality of human dignity instead of the elusive common good that utilitarianism is concerned with. In a recent interview, Jürgen Habermas asserted the Kantian principle that, I quote Habermas in this interview in a German newspaper recently: the efforts of the state to save every single human life must have absolute priority over a utilitarian offsetting of the undesirable economic costs. Then aside the question of whether what Habermas here refers to as utilitarian is actually really utilitarian in the philosophical sense, I think it's not. But the interesting thing in his statement is the Kantian idea of the dignity of the individual. That's clearly a non-utilitarian argument. So the dignity of the individual person is the overriding normative force in determining concrete policies, even if in this case it's very unclear what these might be, these concrete policies. The Kantian standpoint, which is also reflected in a slightly different way in the philosophy of John Rawls, opposes the utilitarian position by not appealing to the common interest. The maxim is simply that the end justifies the means might not be compatible with respect for the individual, because one might have to accept that there will be a necessary number of deaths to achieve the common good. To take an extreme scenario, well, actually, quite such an extreme scenario, it's quite a realistic one. The Kantian position would require the state to save the lives of those who may be too ill to be saved, even if this meant resources may be unavailable for those who could be saved. But it must try, the state must try, even if treatment for those who are less infirm and hold a greater chance of recovery would therefore be declined on the grounds of what can only be a first in the queue solution. In other words, the ethical obligation of the state is to save all lives and not to distinguish which ones are of greater value. And I think also it's a position that is based on not having to consider the practical means of achieving it. What if the state can't achieve it because it doesn't have the ability to achieve it, but it must nonetheless try? There is then a clear difference between the utilitarian and the Kantian responses. What are the indirectly operative and current responses to the pandemic? And they have their compelling arguments. Perhaps the advantage of the Kantian position that I've identified here with Habermas is that it does not put a price on the life of a person or seek to give it a weighting in order to reach the higher goal of the common interest. In contrast, for the utilitarian, saving some lives may not be enough, so why not try to save as many as possible? The appeal to human dignity on its own is also not enough. The current approach to the pandemic, insofar as it's guided by the preservation of human dignity, which I think has in the end got the upper hand, not the utilitarian one, does not give sufficient recognition to the questions of livelihoods and other problems that lockdown presents. And of course, all other illnesses, like for example, cancer patients who are disadvantaged against those who have the coronavirus or who are suspected of having it. Dignity without security is not a solution, as is evidenced by the shocking death rate in care homes, quite aside from other problems such as the rise in domestic abuse, mental health problems that lockdown has created. Yeah, so these problems are especially acute in countries such as Spain, where confinement has been taken to an extreme level. A third position that I've identified, I'll move on to it here now quite quickly, from a libertarian perspective, measures employed by many governments to combat the pandemic encroach excessively on personal freedom. For libertarians, there is nothing more sacred than the liberty of the individual. Enforced social distancing might be accommodated in this worldview, but lockdown certainly not. Here it's a case of the remedy being worse than the disease. From even a moderate libertarian perspective, the reduction of the rate of the death rate does not justify extreme restrictions on the freedom of the individual, as these restrictions entail the removal of rights previously enjoyed. Libertarians, not too surprisingly, feel extremely uncomfortable with the current situation, which also forces them to face some of the unpalatable implications of their own philosophy. And of course, in practical terms, their position is not much different than what radical right-wing populism, especially in the US, propagates. The demand for the cessation of all kinds of confinement is reflected in the growing number of anti-stay-at-home protests in the US, and increasingly now anti-mask protests. Yeah, so the libertarian position is a third one, and that runs counter to the other two I've just mentioned: utilitarianism, the pursuit of the common good, and the Kantian position of the dignity of the individual. A fourth position I'll move on to is, well, essentially the Foucauldian position. And here one recalls the fascinating remarks of Foucault at the beginning of chapter 3, the famous chapter on Panopticism in Discipline and Punish in 1975, where he discusses a pandemic in France and an attempt to impose confinement on pain of death. The current pandemic has generated great interest in the writings of Michel Foucault, not too surprisingly, on the surveillance of space that arose with modernity. The Foucauldian theme of biopolitics and security has been taken up by Giorgio Agamben in the context of state of emergency. This has led to an interesting and somewhat controversial debate among a group of Italian and French philosophers in the tradition of Foucault and biopolitics. For Agamben, the use of a state of exception as a normal paradigm for government is deeply worrying. It leads to the militarization of the polity and an indefinite extension of the state of exception. In Spain, the state of alarm, as it's called, has been extended 5 times over a period of 3 months. It also leads to a generalized condition of fear and anxiety among individuals. Responses to Agamben, whose contribution in some ways is less than serious, in that his original essay refers to the pandemic as an invention, the invention of a pandemic, it's called. Responses have been quick to point out that this interpretation amounts to nothing short than a conspiracy theory. Is the state really using the pandemic to create a permanent state of exemption? Probably not. The Italian state seems incapable of even basic governance, let alone organizing a sanitary dictatorship. And, well, it's not entirely clear that even right-wing governments, Trump and Johnson, were seeking anything like a dictatorship. In fact, it's quite clear they feel deeply uncomfortable with anything of that sort. Yet there are clear trends that point to the rapid expansion of militarized forms of surveillance that cannot be fully accounted for as necessary measures of the pandemic control. Certainly it would seem to me, at least in Spain, where I'm currently living and on research leave, is that the measures to control the pandemic are not particularly effective, and nor basically exercises in technocracy. While Agamben may have exaggerated the political instrumentalization of the pandemic, the important point he makes, and I think he does make an important point, it's that the state of exemption is now becoming the new normal in the art of governance. In Hungary, Orban now rules by decree. The UK government, okay, it's not seeking to become a sanitary dictatorship, but it has been given exceptional powers. In the US, Donald Trump claims to have total control, the expression he's used. The constant renewal of states of emergency with enforced lockdowns is unprecedented in modern democratic theory. Excuse me, I meant to say in modern democratic history. It's difficult to account for such decrees in terms of utilitarianism or in terms of the Kantian concern with human dignity. One only has to take a look at the extraordinary number of deaths in care homes. The implications also go beyond the concerns of libertarians with their appeal to unrestricted personal liberty. For the state of emergency, measures run against the core of democracy. And libertarians are not anyway particularly concerned about democracy, they're only concerned with individual liberty, which is a different question than what I think is the more important question of democracy. Until recently, the state has been widely seen as impotent in the face of globalization, kind of received wisdom of social political theory in recent years, but the pandemic questions that assumption. In fact, the state now holds their total control over populations thanks to the virus. Okay, the state doesn't control the virus, which is global, but the state controls its populations now more than ever before. We can see, I think, quite clearly that. According to Agamben, in a clarification to his original intervention, I quote him here, "A society that lives in a permanent state of emergency cannot be a free one. We effectively live in a society that has sacrificed freedom to so-called security reasons, and as a consequence has condemned itself to living in a permanent state of fear and insecurity." And this condition, I'm arguing, will outlive the state of emergency. So I think, again, it's probably wrong to say there's going to be a permanent state of exemption. That's contradicted by the de-escalation of such states of emergency in any case. Of course, his essay was written at an early stage in the pandemic in March, and his essay reflects the somewhat extreme measures adopted by the governments in Italy and in Spain, and perhaps too in France. Obviously, that's something that can't be generalized to all countries. For example, Germany. Now, I do believe that despite the exaggerated claims that Agamben has made, that he has an important critical point to make, even if there's no concrete proposal on what an appropriate response to the pandemic could be. Surely the state must do something. There's certainly an excess of control, though. Governments are now employing digital surveillance programs for mobile data tracking, apps to record personal contracts, and digital networks equipped with facial recognition. These new technologies are creating lucrative new markets for the extraction, sale, and analysis of private data. The state of emergency will come to an end, and it is currently now in the month of May, coming to the end of the month of May, reaching an end slowly. But perhaps states of emergency will be put back in place later in the year if there's a second spike in the pandemic. But I think the point here is that the states of emergency will come to an end. Let's just say maybe it might take another year until the vaccine is found. Perhaps there will never be a vaccine found. There's not necessarily a vaccine found for everything, for all viruses. But we can, nonetheless, these technologies will continue, and state surveillance will also be given a tremendous boost by the current crisis. So even if governments, let's say the Johnson government or Trump, who are opposed to lockdowns, so even if these governments don't actually want to pursue lockdowns and states of emergency, nonetheless, the state apparatus will, from a systemic and functional point of view, benefit from the responses to it. But nonetheless, one can ask the question: what is the alternative? Agamben doesn't have an alternative. It's only the proposal of the Brazilian President Bolsonaro, simply to do nothing and see the pandemic as a hoax or something that's just going to go away. Well, and that's effectively what Agamben himself has said, what was perhaps an unfortunate formulation when he called the pandemic an invention. In addition to surveillance administered by the state, there are also the societal implications of social distancing. Another contribution in Agamben refers to social distancing as a new kind of social order. Quoting him here, the current health emergency can be considered as the laboratory in which the new political and social devices that await humanity are prepared. In sum, Agamben draws attention to a range of issues that the current crisis raises for democracy. Many of these go back to Foucault's notion of the self as constructed in relations of power, such as those that are now evidenced in new technologies of subjectification, namely social distancing, face masks, self-isolation, and so on. The desire for safety creates even greater dangers that are internalized as freedom and perpetuated by fear. Now, while Agamben underplays the need to find solutions to the pandemic, he offers, in my view, a compelling account of the implications for democracy and social life of some of the measures being taken to deal with the pandemic. Agamben's account is perhaps more compelling when applied to non-Western countries. For example, recently in Nigeria, more people have been killed by police violence in the enforcement of lockdown than have been actually killed by the virus itself. Reading Agamben's reflections, one is struck by the realization that what we're witnessing is an anti-liberal pathogen eating through the fabric of democracy. The social bond itself is the endangered party. Habermas's Kantian appeal to human dignity offers little respite, not least as it is fully compatible with the state of exemption. Excuse me, if that is what is required to protect life itself. And one of the Kantian position is that it doesn't tell us what is the right kind of or the best political means of achieving the desired result, namely the protection of the dignity of the individual. Is there an alternative position that might see something positive emerging out of the current crisis? That brings me to the fifth philosophical position. Zizek, the prominent Lacanian philosopher, offers a more radical response in a recent book. Pandemic COVID-19 Shakes the World. In this book, it seems to have been hastily put together from various writings. He argues that the choice after the pandemic is very much the view to post-pandemic times, is between, quote, barbarism or some form of reinvented communism. Zizek sees the global health crisis as an opportunity for the reinvention of communism. The pandemic reveals the virus of capitalism. The crisis is a call to free ourselves from the tyranny of the market. Governments are slowly engaging with what looks like a major attack on capitalism, which seems to have been put on hold at the moment, with state-sponsored employment for millions of people, and a worldwide suspension of consumerism. In the UK, the hard right-wing government of Johnson that brought us Brexit has to commit to state spending on a scale unimaginable by any left-wing government. Capitalism seems to be on hold for now, but for how long? And who will benefit in the end? Well, as much that Zizek agrees on with Agamben, his conclusions are different. The desire for survival will create new bonds of solidarity, but it's very unclear how this will happen. After all, the nature of a virus is to separate people. And that's what social distancing and self-isolation is supposed to do. It's difficult to see in these developments signs of an alternative political order based on solidarity. It's true that in the past, major pandemics did lead to progressive change. The 1918 influenza pandemic that led to the death of 50 to 100 million people worldwide, led to the creation of national healthcare systems. The Black Death in the 14th century in Europe, which reduced the supply of labor, led to improved conditions for workers, at least in Europe. It's therefore not impossible that out of the current crisis would come some improvements in public policy. However, it's unlikely that something like Zizek's notion of post-capitalist society will suddenly emerge. This skepticism is also expressed by Alain Badiou, the French Maoist philosopher who wrote an inspiring essay, I think, on the epidemic condition. He argues that self-isolation offers a moment for reflection on the future. Perhaps a more pertinent interpretation of post-capitalist position, or some kind of a perhaps post-capitalist is the wrong term here, a post-pandemic position is Bruno Latour's suggestion in a recent essay that the health crisis may be an early sign of a new age of Anthropocene politics. The current biopolitical securitization that we're witnessing is what he calls a dress rehearsal for climate change. It cannot be a coincidence that the health crisis is occurring at the same time as the ecological crisis has taken on a new urgency. So there's clearly some connection to these crises. As he's also argued in another recent essay, the time to fight is now so that the economic recovery, once the crisis is over, does not bring back this same old climate regime that we've been trying quite vainly to fight against so far. Yeah, so that is the fifth position, basically radical post-capitalist scenarios. There's perhaps another position which I'll conclude with, which is less a political philosophy than a development in behavioral science, namely nudge theory. The UK was once again also the laboratory for this new philosophy, following from the failure of what I've characterized as the utilitarian philosophy of herd immunity. Now, according to this new and increasingly influential school of thought, people do not act rationally. Brexit is ample proof of that. What we need to understand is the nature of irrationality in order that it can be controlled. Now, such methods of control are not authoritarian, but are rather nudges and can be done with the support of people who believe that they're making their own choices. The interesting thing here is that in the case of pandemic control, nudge theory has been deemed to have not worked. It did not bring about major changes to behavior within the time frame required. And what was abandoned and has been abandoned in favor of more stringent, fast-acting measures that do not rely on voluntary actions, or self-isolation and frequent hand washing and so on. However, nudge theory does remain as an additional technique of government, and I suspect we're likely to hear more of it. Let me conclude then. All six political positions that I've identified here, obviously all too briefly, have something to offer in the current situation. Zizek sees in the present predicament seeds of progressive change. Again, brings also attention to declarations of emergency as anti-democratic attempts to render populations docile and obedient. These theories bring important critical perspectives to bear on the older political philosophies that are reflected in utilitarianism, Kantianism, and libertarianism. Clearly, governments need to control the spread of the virus, but more reflection is needed on the degree of militarization that is required to do this successfully, and what is acceptable to a democracy. Simple appeals to liberty are not enough for an alternative to lockdowns. Perhaps the more serious question is about democracy than liberty, which is almost always a question of individual liberty. In any case, as Foucault was well aware, capitalism needs liberty and cannot function in totally disciplinary societies. Foucault changed his position slightly later on this question. If there's a single conclusion to be drawn from these contrasting philosophies, it is that the virus is more than a pathogen that threatens the lives of many people, but democracy is also in danger. What is more significant in the long term will be new technologies of governments that are now taking shape in large-scale societal experimentations with the management of populations. Thank you very much.